Before we begin, I just want to say that Megan is volunteering her time for the workshop to help out the community and everyone. So this is not sponsored by any of her past and present employers. And if you want to add her on LinkedIn, I added the link on the resume workshop. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro. You guys can still see the presentation mode version of the slides, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Screen sharing gets a little weird when you present. All right, so I'm Megan. I co-founded SacHacks. Right now I'm at Facebook as a software engineer. I used to be a software engineer at TI like last month. And so I have a side passion aside from SacHacks, and that is all things resume. I used to roast people's resume in colleges. They volunteered for that, but I think it's a lot better to have some critical feedback from your friends than have to waste any opportunities in the professional space. So I want to be able to give you guys and all the compilation of my learnings throughout the past 3 years in doing resumes and any interviews and talking to professionals when I was in college and getting the opportunity for feedback. So the purpose of this workshop is all the nitty-gritty details that nobody really ever tells you. And I do want to provide different perspectives. I've come across a lot of different conflicting information, and while I may tell you the one that I personally prefer, if I have an opinion, I just want to give you guys all the information so that you guys can ultimately choose for yourself what you think is better. I do kind of have a slide at the end that's kind of like, well, take a lot of feedback with a grain of salt because you will get conflicting feedback, and at the end of the day, it's kind of like you should probably go with what you feel is right. So there are, it's not my word is all or anything. There is a level of you guys can choose for what you want, but this is more kind of informational. I do obviously have some own bias, but I'll make that pretty clear to you guys. So we're going to go through a bad example right off the bat, so I can kind of give you a visual of some of the things that I'll be talking about so that you guys can have that in the back of your mind when you're looking at slides. And then I'll talk about formatting, description tenses, sections that are typical on the resume, as well as optional sections, some ATS friendly tips, general tips, and then I have some examples at the end to kind of nail it home. If we have time, it could be a little bit of interactive of like, from what I've told you, what do you see wrong here? So that's kind of the agenda for today. As far as my own experience, I touched on it a little bit, but I used to hold workshops like these when I was in college. I've been out of college for about 1.5 years, and a lot of the stuff too is gained from my own giving own feedback from my friends, giving feedback to my friends, as well as feedback from hiring personnel. But also I used to hire for SacHacks. I used to do the recruiting. And so I know the other side of the table and what to expect or what I'm expecting from the people that I'm looking to hire. So I've been on both sides of the table looking to be hired as well as hiring. But I've also done a lot of research for the current market. So that's a big plus. I originally designed this workshop for a multitude of different people with different levels of experience. So there are things that are dated that I want to bring them to the current market. So the bad example demo, I'm gonna pause my sharing because I have to like bring that up on a whole different screen, like not presenting. 1 second. Okay, so can I share this guy? All right, so this is Amanda's resume. This was actually an example I got from one of my management courses. I'm pretty sure it's not a real person. It's really just for example's sake. So no need to feel bad about peeking into the resume and critiquing the crap out of it. So the first thing that's wrong is there's a picture. This is, I think, a custom in not the United States, like foreign. So there's a little asterisk there. But as far as the United States, we don't do that anymore. It honestly probably takes up way too much of your recruiter time, and it can introduce a lot of bias or judging or anything that you don't want to do, especially in today's market. They kind of are finding ways to be a lot less biased in hiring. So pictures weren't a thing before, and they're definitely not a thing anymore. There's also her full address. You never want to do that anymore. That's kind of a dated thing, where you would have to like mail it and do that kind of correspondence, but everything's on the internet nowadays. The formatting is a bit crazy on the first page too. So it looks like on the bottom with the employment history, it's just kind of a summation of what she's done before. And I think you have to like go through the next 3 pages to find out the description of those. And people don't want to hop around like that. And you shouldn't have 4 pages. Also, there's a whole section about recognition that really doesn't hold anything for her. It doesn't do anything, especially to be on the first page. And there's stuff from like 1998. Like you can tell that this resume is at least 2015. So that's way too old. And the range of experience is a lot of like kind of buzzwords that don't really help at all. That kind of, to me, is the objective or the summary section, which I have a little bit more on later, but I personally don't prefer those unless you're in like a scenario that's kind of a niche scenario. But the rest of the 3 pages is just a big text wall, and like nobody wants to read that. I never read this, and it's a part of my whole workshop. So those are some things to keep in mind, as well as if you see on the top right of the header, it has her name for each page. And I think that's also a dated thing. That was back in the day where you would like print out resumes, and if you like left one page at the printer, then like this would help you put it back together, but everything's online, it's all PDFs. So if you want to put it in, you can. If it messes up your formatting, I don't see a big reason why you need to do that. So let's see. I think I have to do a new share here. Present this. Okay, so we're back to this, and sure. Right. So as far as formatting, there's some examples for page length. It's a little bit subjective because some people have a certain preference, and some people are just like, it should be 1 page no matter what. But if you do want to have more pages, it would be because you have more experience and you make good use of having 2 pages. So if you are 1 to 3 years of experience, you definitely do not want to go over 1 page for any reason. If you choose that you want to have more than 1 page, the kind of buckets you can fall in is 4 to 7, maybe like 9 years of experience. You can have up to 2 pages, and then definitely up to 3 pages when you have 10 plus years of experience. You do not want to go over 3 pages. Depending on your own experience, if you're like 8 or 9 years and you really need 3 pages, like it's really just up to you. And then I kind of went over this with Amanda's resume. It is a custom to put your name in the header of sequential pages if you have more than 1 page, but I do feel that that is pretty dated. So that's just a subjective take for you. I don't think I mentioned this in the beginning. If you see a little asterisk, that means this is a subjective take. I'll explain the different takes to you, and that's how that's gonna go. The next one is if you have, you only have about 6 to 30 seconds for recruiters to look at your resume, and we read left to right and top to bottom, right? So therefore, the most important stuff should be in the top half of your page, especially top left. I personally have 2 columns, and I put the left column as my headers of the sections that I have, mostly because I feel like it also helps people scan. So me personally, I have like my experience section and then my leadership section. I have other stuff above experience, but the leadership's like right at the middle. And to make people kind of look at that section if they're scanning for leadership, because it's in the bottom half, I feel like it's a lot easier when it's pretty prominent on the left versus a kind of top down style that you see in a lot of people. But that's just a personal preference. But I do have some like feeling inside that it helps with easy navigation. It's kind of like a table of contents, but it's good use of white space. As far as formatting, do's and don'ts, you definitely want to be consistent. When you have certain formatting, you need to have the formatting at least consistent within one section. I personally prefer to have it kind of commute across the entire resume for things that are similar, like dates go in almost all sections in the middle of my resume, and so I make those the same. My formatting is pretty consistent throughout, but if you really need to get away from it, just be at least consistent within one section. And this can be even the smallest thing. The most typical thing I see is when you have the date range, sometimes the little dash in the middle will be like a short dash. Sometimes it'll be really long. Sometimes they don't have spaces on both sides. They only have it like on one side, or sometimes they have no spaces and other times they have spaces. So things like that are definitely, they can stick out for detail-oriented people pretty easy. So another thing I do suggest you guys do is when you edit your resume, before you send it out massively, have one of your like most anal friends look at it and see any inconsistencies. Maybe try to get somebody that's super detail-oriented and pick out like the most nitty-gritty things ever. And that'll really help you guys. It's really easy when you live and breathe your resume and you're editing it for days that you just mentally blow over stuff when you read it. So you want fresh eyes. Another thing you want to do is consider readability. So you don't want a big text wall. Nobody's going to read that. Nobody's going to want to read that. And you won't get even your full 6 to 30 seconds. And another thing to do is play with the white space. That can help with your readability too. So for example, having 2 columns makes it easy to have white space, or lines between different sections to help kind of categorize your resume. The next don't is don't use a template. This is subjective. I didn't actually put an asterisk, but I personally think everybody and their mother kind of uses a template, so you're not really going to stand out. And a lot of templates are blatantly obvious that they're templates, and you often have to try to fit your information into what they gave you, and if it doesn't really work, then it's a bit obvious. And a lot of templates use graphics. So this is if you're not a designer. I'm personally a tech person, so there are a little bit of niche things in here that are geared towards tech people. But designers are a little different. They can have some graphics, but as far as tech people, you don't want to have nothing big and flashy, colorful. You kind of just stay towards the black, grayscale, maybe blue if you're feeling adventurous, but that's the extent. You don't want to have the little LinkedIn graphic or the little scales of how proficient you are, or like the little education cap. That's not the place for this. And along that, you don't want to have a highly designed resume. I will show you guys a designer's resume at the end too, but you can tell when it's super designed, that's just not what tech people have. It's pretty like clear cut, basic. It's what they want. Because it may come off a little unprofessional for like non-designer people. Designers can use it to exemplify their work, but most of us, I don't think in this audience, are in that boat. I already kind of went over text walls, and I already went over the picture of yourself. So we'll move on. I think I'm gonna pause this real quick because it kind of flipped on me about which screen it wanted to put the presentation on. And so, okay, back in business here, I think. So the next thing is there are 2 options for tenses, and it is a subjective tape. So I'm giving you both of them. You can either have all your descriptions in the present tense, or you can go with past tense. But if you do past tense, you need to have anything in your current role be present tense. I personally prefer present tense because, one, it takes up less space. You don't need to have like all the EDs or anything on your verbs. And I have this thing in my mind, and I've had this verified by recruiters, but I feel that if you read a resume in present tense and you've done your resume right, a recruiter can picture you doing it in the role that they're trying to fill. And if you have it in past, it's like, well, if they haven't done it in a while, can they still hold their weight in this role? And it gets a little questionable. But if you try to do some in past, some in present, then the next logical question is like, okay, well, what if in my current role, I've been there for like 5 years and I list things that I've done all 5 years, but there's some that I only did in year 1. Does that become past tense at that point? And the answer is no. But I just avoid all of that and do it all in present tense. But I think the past tense, the second option, is a little bit more common for older market goers or people that have been in recruiting for a while. This used to be like the thing to do and the only option. So some people just really prefer that. But you do not want to mix tense within one experience, no matter what option you choose. You don't want to, it's pretty jarring for the recruiter when they read like a past verb and then a present verb, and you don't want to do that at all, no matter which of these options you choose. So there are a few typical sections that each resume should have. There are some optional ones, but the typical ones are, there should be contact information, skills, experience, and education. And so I'll go into each of these a little bit more in detail. So as far as the contact information, you obviously want your name, but a good measure is to have it be 2 times the font size of your normal writing, a bit for emphasis. This is kind of just, a good guideline. If it's like 2 times minus 2 point font, it's not a big issue. It's just for emphasis and making people have it stick out because that's their only action item on a resume. You do definitely want to have your phone, your email, and your LinkedIn. LinkedIn is super important. A lot of people that have been out of the market for the past like 3-5 years, they're like, what's LinkedIn? But in this market, you definitely need a LinkedIn, especially in COVID times. So if you don't have a LinkedIn, don't go over it too much in this workshop. You can feel free to reach out to me or look at my LinkedIn for a good example, self-plug, no shame. But you shouldn't label them, in my opinion. It's a bit subjective, but they're all different. Like one's numbers, one has a domain, one is like a URL. Like you're not gonna think, oh, let me call the email. So I think people have enough common sense here, but a lot of older timers are like, you need to label them. If you do label them, make sure you're at least consistent. Like some people will spell out email, but then they'll just put like a C for cell when it's like a couple more letters. So another consistency thing. But as far as your LinkedIn, you have a couple options. So you could do the full format as I have listed here. So starting from the linkedin.com all the way on, I don't think you really need to put like the HTTPS for sure. I don't think you really need the www dot, but if you wanted to, it's better than having the full thing. But people understand that it's a URL, and you can type it in as this way, and it'll still work when you put it into the search bar. Or you can have just the really shorthand version and have the personal version. You do want to at least include the /in so that people understand that it's LinkedIn. But you also do want to have a personalized URL. So Jane-Doe versus Jane-Doe and like 5 gajillion numbers after it, because nobody's going to want to type that in. So you're able to personalize that within your LinkedIn profile. Another optional context inclusion is the GitHub, if you're technical, but also depending on your experience. So if you have like cobwebs in your GitHub, like you never use it or you haven't used it in years, don't put it. If it doesn't exemplify good coding behavior, like good commit messages, a solid flow, probably not the best example to give. The other inclusion will be your location. Do not put your full street address. That it gets into a lot of privacy concerns nowadays. Nobody's going to show up at your job with an offer in hand. It could just introduce a lot of unsafe measures. But what you could include is your city and your state. It's a bit subjective depending on your situation. So if you want to relocate, maybe, and you don't want to be excluded because you don't live in that city, maybe you don't put your current city, or maybe you put like looking to relocate to the Bay Area or something. Some ATSs really scan for what city the place is located in. So if you don't have any city, it may just exclude you anyways. One piece of information I've gotten is to spell out the state. And that was for people that are like, well, if you think about the states that start with an A, do you really know the difference between like Alaska and like Arkansas or Alabama? And I probably don't, but I also live in California, and like we're the only one with a CA. There's only Colorado that's another C, so people understand California. But I also personally feel like if you're recruiting for a certain state, you should know what the state acronym is. But a lot of relocation and like remote working in the day of COVID, you could have a recruiter that's like across the United States recruiting for a California role. So that's up to you if you have the space for it or you care about safeguarding other people's stupidity. You can do that. So another section is the skills section. And for technical people, you can include your technical competencies, like the languages you can code in, but you want to have them be relevant. This kind of goes for everything you put on your resume, but skill section especially, you don't want to put a language that you've only coded in for like 2-3 weeks and you really aren't comfortable getting tested on it. Because if you put it on your resume, it's fair game. So if you can hold your own, go ahead and put it on there. But also, if you list everything you've ever touched, the relevant things can get lost, or you could take up too much space for things that people don't really care about. So I really shorten it down to the skills that are kind of listed, plus maybe something I'm really good at isn't listed, I'll still put that. But not everything you've ever touched. If you speak multiple languages, like English, Spanish, those type of languages, you can put that too. But if you put both programming languages and other like dialect languages, you may want to specify which ones are which and put it in a different section. And soft skills. This is a bit subjective. I feel like in a technical industry, it doesn't hold much weight because anything soft skills, they're still gonna see if you have it during your interviews. Like you can say you're a detail-oriented person, but if you have inconsistencies in your resume, they're gonna be like, yeah, right. Or there are certain ones that, you know, they're not just gonna take your word for it. So I feel like you shouldn't waste the space on it. But some industries, you can only really put soft skills, so that's subjective. Or if your resume is a little bare, you can throw that on there too. It really happens for inexperienced people as well, to have soft skills. But I suggest you categorize them by similarity. So for example, I kind of label 3 different skill sections. So languages, as in programming languages, software or tools or frameworks or specializations. You can get a little crafty depending on how much you know, because like maybe you can get away with putting languages / frameworks if you really only know 1 or 2 frameworks and you don't want to take up a whole other line. Some people are like, if you're a coder and you put languages, you should put programming languages as the word. I'm personally like, as soon as you see C, C++, Python, you know what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to waste a word. But like I said, if you do like dialect languages too, you should list them as separate, as I've listed in the bullet there. A piece of feedback that I've gotten is list them by proficiency. And I don't necessarily agree with it, but the logic behind that was from a pretty emotional, intelligent recruiter or interviewer that was like, if you tell me you're a beginner at C, I'm not going to ask you expert level questions in C just to watch you flounder. I don't think many recruiters are that emotionally intelligent. I think they know what bar they need for the role, and if you don't have it, whether you say beginner or not, that doesn't give you any leeway. I also think it kind of puts you at a disadvantage, because if you list, oh, I'm a beginner in C, and you're out for a C role, and somebody just lists C with no other proficiency, you kind of look less experienced than them, in my opinion. But if you want to do proficiency, just don't put the graphic scales. It's a bit distracting, and it really doesn't like, it takes a lot of time to read them correctly, which just puts you at a disadvantage to yourself, in my opinion, versus kind of just across and they can find out. And then it's also kind of subjective too. Like you can say you're an 8 out of 10, but in an interview be like, you're a 3, so who knows, right? And I mentioned it a little bit before, but you only want to include the relevant skills you're comfortable with, because it's free game and you can be asked it. So definitely don't lie on your resume in any sense. As far as the experience section, you do want to order reverse chronologically and by the end date. It gets a little tricky because you could have like a 5-year role that started in 2017. And you can have like a really short 1-year role that started in 2018 and ended in 2019. And you think, well, shouldn't the most recent one be up front? But if you're still in the role from 2017, that's not how it goes. If you get a little confused, you can look at LinkedIn and how they order it, and that'll help you. But if you have some relevant experiences that are later than your most recent ones, you can kind of get around this by doing 2 different sections, a relevant experience section and the other experience section, so that you would be able to have reverse chronological within each different experience section, so that you can bring forth the roles that are more relevant and to the top of the resume to catch their eye when they're looking at your resume to show that you are a good fit for this job. You do want to use bullets when you're describing your experiences. Don't want to do paragraphs. It's just a lot harder to read. It ends up being a text wall, not kind of adding white space. And it just, people don't want to read text walls. So you want to kind of have more bullets in your recent experience. It is a guideline to be roughly double than the other experiences, but if you don't have enough information to make it double, don't just make up bullets to meet that guideline. It's pretty subjective to what you've been through and what you can communicate. Maybe you just did really one thing the whole time you're in a job, so don't use up too much space just to hit that guideline. But if you're questioning kind of like, I have so many bullets, you don't want to have like too many bullets. So you don't want to have more than 6 bullets as a guideline, again, per experience for 1-page resumes. And you should try to avoid having 1 bullet for an experience, mostly because I've actually been told this, like I'll have a 6-month internship and I really only did one thing, so I only have 1 bullet, but they're like, that was a 6-month internship, you really like only did that, or it makes it seem like you didn't really do anything. But if you don't have more to say, just don't make up anything, just for the sake of having more bullets. Also, for the sake of 1-page resumes and using the best use of your space, you want to avoid having a hanging line. So you can see in the before section, this is a bullet straight from my resume. I have "and operations" just hanging there, taking up a whole line, even though it's 2 words. So if I'm pressed for space, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to take out operations because it's pretty similar to logistics, And they get the gist that I recruited for people with different skill sets. So that after bullet allows me to save an extra line for something that will be more useful than just and operations. Second, for experience, the format is very important. You do want to have an action verb, the task you did, and a result. The result is where a lot of people lack. And mind you, it doesn't necessarily have to be in this order, but you want to have all three of these. And well, technically the action verb has to be in the beginning, but like the result with a verb in the beginning is fine. And I talk about that a little bit later. But you want to use strong action verbs. You use is a pretty weak action verb, utilize is a bit stronger, but there is a bit of action verbs that are a lot more impactful, like optimize and reduce or drive, spearhead, right? A lot of people will be like, well, I need a verb, so I'm going to do worked or maintained. Those don't really speak to good actions that should be on a resume. And even if that's really what you did, you can just Google a synonym and find a stronger action verb. And if you have repeated verbs, just try to use a synonym, and it'll do a lot better for you. So you can have reduce and decrease rather than have reduce twice. A lot of resumes I see are just like work, 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 and we're not Rihanna, or I think that's Beyonce. Oh well. So you do want to have results, because that will differentiate you from being a doer versus an achiever. So a lot of people run into having their resume look like a job description. And while that may be easy to map to the job that you're trying to get, it doesn't really make you stand out. And it doesn't show the impact you had on a company. And impact is really what counts. I personally was at TI for a little bit over a year, but the impact I had makes people think, oh, okay, I could probably just move her up to a second year level, and like she went quick for her time, right? If you just list responsibilities, they're gonna take your time as just that, because it doesn't really equate to anything but time. That's the only metric there, that's the only number there. So it can help you stand out as well. Because a lot of people can just have the title software engineer and they can maintain code and resolve bugs. Does that that doesn't really make you stand out? But if you're saying, well, I reduced manual maintenance time by 80%, they're like, damn, I wish we had that, and I want to bring them here to do that. And it is a lot, makes you stand out a lot more than just the job, right? It can help you show potential, that you're a leader, that you're results oriented, you understand the impact of your actions, you're not just a code monkey or something. And if you're going to do results, which you should, you want to have relative results. So you can see here the 2 bullets that I have straight from some version of my resume, where I said that I optimized low-level device drivers, blah, 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 to reduce code size by 1,000 bytes. Like, how many people here get the impact of that? A lot of people don't even understand the difference between bytes and bits still. So what you want to do is have a relative term. Those can be percentages, dollars, like straight up numbers, so that people, no matter what level of technicality they are, they will understand, oh crap, 20%, that's like a fifth of a pizza. That's some good stuff right there. Only like really low level embedded or hardware people will understand how much 1,000 bytes really means to them. So as far as your sentence structure, you can play around with where you put the result to play with how it reads and what impact it has when you read it. So I'll read both bullets for you, and hopefully you feel what I'm talking about. So the first one is the result at the end. The second one is the result up front. So optimize low-level device drivers to maximize code reuse and reduce code size by 20%. The second one is reduce code size by 20% by optimizing low-level device drivers to maximize code reuse. So here in the first bullet, the big thing here is reducing code size by 20%. But because there's kind of two results, like maximize code reuse and reduce code size, by the time you get to the end of the sentence, it's kind of lost and you're sick of reading, and maybe you don't even read all the way to the right. So you could bring it up front and be like, hey, I did this really big thing. How did I do it? If you care to read on, go ahead. But if you didn't, you know that it had impact, right? So it also kind of helps with your sentence structure in many bullets in a row. So if you speak the same way in all of them, it can feel pretty monotonous and like formulaic. So you can flip it too if it makes sense and it helps to also have that kind of result too, on multiple bullets in a row. So while I say you want results, they don't necessarily have to be numerical results. Like if you can't quantify it, don't just throw a random number in there because I told you to put a number in there. I see that in a lot of inexperienced resume writers. And these two are an example. I actually got it as a resume once for review. And so you can see the first bullet, like the number is basically 45-year-old. So does this bullet change if they were 44? No. So it doesn't, you really shouldn't have that type of number in there. It just is throwing a number in for sake. The second one is 3% over 9 weeks. I'm not a business major, so maybe this is like a really good percentage, but to somebody that's not in the field, 3% seems like weak sauce to me. So maybe because it's 9 weeks, it's better than like 6 months. But this is where I say to not lie or exaggerate results, because in this example, it's so easy to just be like, 5 is a round number. I'll put 5. Are they really going to call me on it? And I'm like, well, is that 2% worth losing a job or being blackballed from a company because you lie? And if you're going to lie on your resume, who knows what you're going to lie about, right? So that's where you just don't lie or exaggerate your results. It can get a little obvious too. Like if you're like reduce manual maintenance time by 100%, that's like, well, unless you made robots, that's not true. And also, I talk about this a little bit later, but you should have your LinkedIn kind of mirror your resume. So when you update your resume, like the description bullets, you should put that on your LinkedIn too. Like recruiters will look at both, and a lot of times they just don't line up, and that's a big oversight on the person trying to get a job, but that could be a big tell of character that the recruiters can read into. But also, they find LinkedIn to be a lot more trustworthy because it is a social media platform, and you probably have some of your teammates on there. So if you go and lie, they have the chance to call you out. But if it's on your resume that you only distribute privately when you're looking, you know, you can say whatever the fuck you want, right? So you should just have them both match, and they should both not lie, and you'll be fine. As far as education, it gets further down your resume the longer you are into your career, a lot because your work is a lot more relevant at that point and trained you better for any other job than school really does. Hot tip, it really does matter. Your work is a lot more important than your career. I mean, your education once you get past a certain point. But as a rough example, if you are less than 2 years out of college, it's okay to be at the top because it can help explain gaps, right? So I personally have education, and then my 2 experiences as of last month were TI full-time from 2019 to 2020, but then I had a gap when I was doing my senior year of school. So my internship is like the summer of 2018. But they can look up like an inch and see, okay, well, she graduated in 2019. That's where that time went. That's fine. I've actually seen a recruiter have a resume where the girl was like a year out of college, but she put education at the bottom, and she had that gap. And he was like, well, can you explain this to me? He didn't really look at the bottom because he only looks at the top half, right? If you are 7+ years out, definitely at the bottom. At that point, it's just really you could probably have gotten away with not even having an education in today's society, and just have relevant experience. People usually don't look at it, or get to the bottom. You don't need to take up valuable real estate at the top half. Then if you're between 2 and 7 years, it really depends on your experiences. Like if you are at one company for 7 years and you don't have too much bullets, or until you don't have a lot of experiences, maybe you want to put it at the top, because maybe it's a prestigious university, and it's your alma mater and it tells a lot about your character or something. But it can also introduce bias about being junior. So let's say you're 3 years out of college and you have it at the top. Seeing it at the top might be like, oh, well, we're looking for a senior role that has like 4 to 7 years of experience, and you're still listing college at top, and I see your GPA, I'm not going to even read further, right? So it kind of really depends when you're in that gray area. Some people are like, well, if you're 1 year out of college plus, just put it at the bottom. But if you're trying to find a new job after only a year, you're in this really weird area where like some people see you as a new grad. Some people are like, oh, you're just too far out to be a new grad, but you're too low to be our next like associate level. So it's a weird area. But as far as your graduation year, the timeline and the same logic kind of follows, about listing it. Because ageism is a real thing. And if you are like 20, 30 years into your career and they see, oh, you graduated in like 1980, that just gives them the math to hold any bias against you. Whereas if you don't list it, they're not going to sit here and add up the years listed on your experience to see how old you are, right? But maybe it helps explain gaps, like you were a bachelor's, you did 10 years of work, and now you're back in school, right? At that point, you probably put your master's that you're getting currently at the top or something. But, you know, I've also had somebody that was a year out, she didn't put it, and then he was like, okay, now I can't understand your gaps, and like I know you're young, so it doesn't really matter if you're like 23 or 25 at this point. Ageism is a thing for being too junior though, and too senior. So a lot of people don't get the junior part or consider that part. But if you have 7+ years of experience, just don't list your graduation year, and they don't really need to know that. And if you take it off your resume, you should take it off your LinkedIn too. So if you have a strong line of experiences under your belt, it doesn't really do you any good. It could just do you harm or give them too much information. With your GPA, I would say if it's your first or your second job out of college, and it's a good GPA relative to your major, I think 3.5 is like the lowest it goes, and that's for computer science people. Then you can put it. But if it's like really below, if it's very high and you want to flex, maybe that's the type of person you are, like it's a 3.9, you can put it, I suppose. It kind of shows how you are as a student. I would think it shows who you are as a person and you're trying to flex on these people. But other than that, I wouldn't list it. Companies really don't care. If they care, they'd ask for it. And otherwise, it just takes up space. And it can introduce bias about being junior. Like I said, if you're kind of like 1, 2, 3 years out of college and they see that you still care about your GPA, they're just going to assume that you're too junior. Not everybody, but worst case recruiters, they ain't got time for anything. They could just find any reason to skip over you. And this whole presentation is to not give them those small, tiny reasons. So some other sections that you can have are leadership, projects, relevant courses or certifications, awards that are not from like 1998, volunteer experience, community involvement or activities, hobbies with an asterisk, meaning I would only do it with accomplishment-based hobbies. So you're a swim team captain and you received a gold medal, not I knit sometimes when I'm bored. it can help relate to high-end personnel, but I personally think like the chances of actually finding somebody that also really loves macrame are pretty slim, and it could just take up space then. It could make you a little bit more memorable, but it's really if you are really hard up for filling your white space, in my opinion. Or it's pretty awesome of like gold medal at the Olympics or something. The next section is kind of, they all fit into the same physical location in the paper to me, but they can all be done pretty differently. So the objective, the summary, and the accomplishments. So the objective, that's like seeking internship in this because this. Don't even waste your space. Like if you are applying to that job, they know you want that job, right? The only person or company that I've ever been told that they really want that objective is Intel. And that's a pretty old timer culture. So it just takes up space in my opinion. But the alternative, one of them is the summary. So this makes sense to me if your career path is not obvious from your experiences and or you want to make a switch, right? So let's say you have VR experience, you have startup experience, but you've been in big tech for like 5 years and you're applying to be like at a VR startup. So you could be like, I want to use my old VR and startup experience plus the technical experience I've gotten from big tech to go back into the VR startup culture that I ultimately want to end up at or something, right? Or if you're changing industries, you can use it to say like, I want to use my insert relevant transferable skills here to go into this industry. Because some people will be like, she don't even go here. Like, I'm not going to give her a chance, right? So that's one way to use a summary. Or the accomplishments. This kind of has to do with a lot later in your career when maybe your big hard-hitting accomplishments were when you were still young and springy, but you don't think that they're gonna look at your 3-page resume all the way at the bottom. So you can bring them up at the top, show all your impact, and make a better impression. For projects, you can provide links to them. I personally think it distracts the eyes because you have like this all black resume and then all of a sudden like this blue hyperlink that like nobody's gonna click as a recruiter. It's really at the later stages when they're like picking between different people that maybe they'll go digging into your history. But at the end of the day, your resume is a marketing document to get your foot in the door and kind of have a TLDR of who you are. But I feel like LinkedIn's a better spot for a link because some people, maybe they just want to connect with you. They see that you're in your space, they see a cool project and they want to just kind of check it out, right? It seems a little bit more appropriate given that it's a little bit more modern of a platform than a resume. This may change because we're now in the technical era and it's all PDFs, but that's how I feel. I don't feel like most people would spend the time to take the link anyways, but definitely don't include the link if it's not a strong project and it doesn't speak to good coding conventions or practice. Okay, so the ATS Friendly tips portion. So this is some tips that I've curated myself and a little bit of knowledge from over the years. So if you save your resume in a plain text format and check that all the data came over correctly, most likely your ATS is fine. Obviously the formatting is going to go away because it's a plain text format. But if you see that there's some gaps in communicating across the data, then you know that your resume isn't ATS friendly and you can fix it before you shoot it off into the black hole. You also don't want to have like text boxes in your resume because those will not get parsed by most ATSs. So also, I'll show you guys an example of this a little bit later, but a lot of times when you have sections and you want to like underline it in your resume to really like emphasize that this is a different section and it's like the whole line that goes across the entire resume, those can be interpreted as new lines to some ATSs. As of 2018, maybe they got more advanced. I personally wouldn't take the risk, but so if you have like your contact information line under like education, and then you list everything, and you have skills line, they will only get your name and your contact information and the word education, because it'll be interpreted as a new line. So it'll cut off your data. If you do have matching job titles, it will increase your ATS score. So ATS is an applicant tracking system, and they give you a score by how relevant your experiences are to the role and or job description that they are out for. So if you have a matching job title, it's great. It's going to give you better points. That doesn't necessarily mean change your entire job title just to fit, even though that really wasn't your job title or it's not really relevant to your role. Some can be a little subjective, like anybody can be called a software engineer, but there's so many different things that you could have done. And so sometimes they'll put like, say, embedded software engineer or like backend. And if you just put software engineer and they want like an embedded software engineer, they probably will query for software engineer, in my opinion. But saying you're an embedded software engineer, if your title was really a software engineer, it's not too far of a stretch to just make that jump. Also, I personally have a skills section on my resume, as most people should, but it's just words or languages. And that is super easy to customize your resume to bring out the relevant skills, rather than kind of like playing the, let me copy paste the job description into mine. This will give you easy ATS check marks for any skills that they're querying, and it takes like a couple seconds to change when you're editing your resume for certain jobs, which I think I talk about next. Is that you should tailor your resume for each role to some extent. Don't spend 5 ever on it, but you can highlight the specific skills that are in the job description to boost the ATS outcome, as I mentioned before. You do want to bring out the relevant experiences first. Like I said, you can do a relevant experience section and an other experience section. But this will make it easier for people to see that you're a good fit in the top half. Another example of why you should tailor is maybe you have a summary section on one version, but you don't on another. Maybe you're open to switching fields, but you also are considering staying. You wouldn't have a summary on both, or at least you shouldn't. But an easy way to not waste all your time is to keep a master resume for every experience or bullet you have in your descriptions that you can pull from when you're tailoring your resume. So for example, if you're at a job for like 10 years and you had like 30 bullets because you've done so many different things, but the job you're out for only really wants one of those, you can just pull like 6 of those bullets over, and then you're good. You can also kind of have your LinkedIn serve as that. I kind of do that because I have way more experiences than can fit on one page. And I keep my LinkedIn matching my resume, so that can work for you guys too. But also, as I mentioned before, your LinkedIn should go hand in hand with the resume, because at the end of the day, they are complementary marketing pieces. They give you, basically, they sell you in different means. Like LinkedIn is all about your story, whereas the resume is kind of like a dated thing that's just like bum, bum, bum with bullets, right? But as I mentioned before, you should update your LinkedIn descriptions when you do your resume so that they do kind of match and it shows that you're detail-oriented and you have upkeep on both. But you can have more experiences on your LinkedIn than your resume, especially if it's not going to fit. And you want to filter by relevance on your resume. But I personally have a couple more bullets on my LinkedIn than I do on my resume for certain experiences, or like maybe my TI experience already has like 6 bullets, and I'm not really going to put that I made the very first white elephant Christmas celebration when the company hasn't done any Christmas celebrations in 20 years. It's a nice fun thing, but I'm not going to put that on my resume. Or I'll put, made team morale be still good when we're working from home or something. Like, that's a nice check to have, to show mostly that I can work from home, but I'm not going to put that on my resume. General tips part 2 is to not list irrelevant items. So nobody cares about your SAT score. Unless you're a freshman in college, nobody cares about your high school things. And you definitely don't want to put any unprofessional items, like maybe you were the longest keg stand in your fraternity or sorority, but that's cool, but you probably don't want to put that on your resume. You don't want to lie or exaggerate the numbers. As I've talked about before, it's just not worth it. And when you're taking feedback on your resume, at the end of the day, it is your resume. And you can get a lot of contradicting feedback, but ultimately you want to choose what feedback works for you and that you agree with the most. Obviously, there's some asterisks to that. Like, if you get the same piece of feedback from 20 different people and you just really don't want to accept it, maybe at that time you should, have some personal inflection. But sometimes it just doesn't work for you. Maybe it messes up your consistencies in your formatting, or maybe it emphasizes stuff that you don't really want to emphasize. Like, if you have one big name company and like 5 other no names, and you choose the formatting that emphasizes the company name before your role, might not be the best trade-off. I've actually had that suggested. So